Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world. Today, we are taking you into a piece of history that, quite frankly, completely unravels the standard narrative of 20th century technological progress.
Yeah, we're looking at the foundational research laid out in Annie Jacobsen's incredible book, Operation Paperclip, the secret intelligence program that brought Nazi scientists to America.
And the premise we are exploring today is heavy. We're going to look at how a democratic nation, the United States, built its most advanced, celebrated weapons using the direct expertise of scientists who had, well, just finished serving a defeated genocidal regime.
Right, and our mission for this deep dive is to look at this beyond just the immediate emotional reaction. I mean, it is incredibly easy to look back at this history and label it a massive moral scandal.
Which it absolutely is.
Which it is. But if we stop at outrage, we fail to understand the mechanics of how the world actually works. Our goal today is to analyze the underlying institutional system that made these exact, seemingly shocking decisions highly predictable.
We want to map out the architecture of the post-war intelligence and military apparatus, right?
Exactly. The core question is, how does a system that was explicitly designed and mandated to punish war crimes end up, in just a few short years, effectively rewarding those very same crimes? What are the mechanisms, the shifting incentives, and the bureaucratic workarounds that allow an institution to completely reverse its core mandate?
So to you listening right now, we are asking you to look past the highly visible, incredibly famous triumphs of the 20th century. When you picture the space race, or the massive Saturn V rocket, or the first astronauts, you are seeing a polished, triumphant surface.
A very carefully constructed surface.
Yeah. Today, we want to peel that back and examine the hidden institutional logic underneath. How do the systems we build to protect ourselves end up radically redefining what justice even means? Okay, let's unpack this. I want to start by setting the scene of the exact visceral moment where the Allies first began to realize the sheer scope of what Nazi science had been up to. The date is November 26, 1944, and we are in Strasbourg, France.
This is, it's really a critical pivot point in the timeline of the war.
It really is. Strasbourg is this beautiful medieval city full of cobblestone streets. Technically, it has just been liberated by the 2nd French Armored Division 3 days prior, but the city is still an active war zone.
Right, there is absolute chaos outside.
Total chaos. German mortar rounds are bombarding the streets. Air battles are raging overhead. There is no electricity anywhere in this city. And yet, in the center of town, inside a very fancy upscale apartment on Quai Klebar, there is this bizarre, quiet scene.
Yeah, an armed guard of U.S. soldiers is protecting 3 men who are sitting in armchairs, just reading documents by flickering candlelight.
Right. Who exactly are these men, and why are they sitting in an apartment in the middle of a mortar bombardment?
Well, these are not military generals making tactical battle plans. These are men of science. Leading the group is a man named Samuel Goudsmit. He's a brilliant Dutch-American particle physicist.
And just to give you an idea of his caliber, he's the scientist who famously identified the concept of electron spin in physics when he was, just 23 years old?
Exactly, a total prodigy. During the war, he worked at an MIT weapons lab. But in this apartment in Strasbourg, he is operating in a different capacity. He's the scientific director of a top-secret military mission called Operation Alsos, which was this intelligence-gathering offshoot of the Manhattan Project.
So he is a physicist hunting for scientific intelligence who is with him in the apartment.
Sitting next to him are Bill Promarty and Fred Wardenberg. These two are specialized bacteriological warfare experts. And the reason they are set up in this specific apartment on Quai Klebar is because it belonged to Dr. Eugen Hagen.
Right, the German virus expert.
Yeah, Hagen had fled the city just days before the Allies arrived. He left in such a massive hurry that he left a framed photo of Hitler right on the mantelpiece, and more importantly, he left all his files in his cabinets.
So Goudsmit, Cromarty, and Wardenberg are sitting there, eating military care rations by candlelight, frantically reading through Hagen's abandoned files, searching for clues about the Nazis' ABC warfare programs, atomic, biological, and chemical weapons.
And as they're reading through these files, which, probably just look like mundane academic correspondence, they stumble onto something that causes Goudsmit and Wardenberg to literally yell out loud at the exact same moment.
They find a letter dated November 15th, 1943. It is a memo from Dr. Hagen to an anatomist named Dr. August Hirt. Can you walk us through what that letter actually said and why it was such a massive shock to these Allied scientists?
The text of the letter is chilling in its bureaucratic detachment. Hagen writes to Hirt, and I quote, Of the 100 prisoners you sent me, 18 died in transport. Only 12 are in a condition suitable for my experiments. I therefore request that you send me another 100 prisoners between 20 and 40 years of age who are healthy and in a physical condition comparable to soldiers. Heil Hitler, Professor Dr. E. Hagen.
I mean, he is ordering human beings like they are lab mice. He is complaining that the prisoners died in transport and requesting a fresh batch of healthy humans. And this isn't just a random sadistic fringe doctor doing this in a basement, is it? Who exactly was Dr. Eugen Hagen in the global scientific community?
That is the dual realization that hits Goudsmit in that room. The first is the undeniable horror of medical experiments on healthy humans supplied by Himmler's SS from concentration camps. But the second realization is the strategic implication of who was conducting them. Dr. Eugen Hagen was world-renowned. He was a pioneer.
Right. He had worked in the U.S. previously.
He had. In 1932, he worked at the Rockefeller Foundation in New York, where he helped develop the world's first yellow fever vaccine. In 1937, he was a serious contender for the Nobel Prize. He was an absolute master in the field of vaccines.
Which begs the question, why does a world-renowned vaccine expert need hundreds of healthy prisoners?
That leads directly into a concept in biological warfare known as the sword and the shield.
I want to make sure we really understand this concept because it seems foundational to the entire military logic that follows. How does the sword and shield dynamic actually work in practice?
In biological warfare, you cannot unleash a deadly pathogen upon your enemy, which is the sword, unless you have already successfully developed and administered a vaccine to your own troops and civilians, which is the shield. If an army hasn't built the shield, deploying the sword is suicide.
The biological weapon will inevitably blow back and wipe out your own population.
Exactly. So finding hard documentary evidence that a world-class vaccine expert like Hagen is requesting hundreds of healthy prisoners to rapidly test vaccines on proves to Goudsmit that the Third Reich is actively, aggressively developing the shield.
And if they are rushing to develop the shield, it strongly implies that the sword, the offensive biological weapon, is already built or very close to deployment.
Yes, that is terrifying. You are sitting in a war zone, the war isn't over yet, and you suddenly realize the enemy might be preparing to drop weaponized pathogens on allied cities.
And Hagen wasn't working alone. His files contain correspondence with other doctors, essentially giving Goudsmit a master list of the Nazi biological warfare network. Who else was on that list?
From those files, Goudsmit begins to identify the key nodes of this horrific network. He identifies Dr. Kurt Blum, who was the Deputy Surgeon General of the Third Reich. Blum was the man officially in charge of the Nazi biological weapons programs. He was building the sword.
Okay, so Blum is the sword.
Right. And Goudsmit also identifies Surgeon General Walter Schreiber,
Right.
who was in charge of the military vaccine programs. The shield. This raises an important question. If a celebrated Nobel-contending scientist like Hagen could conduct these horrific experiments with total impunity, utilizing concentration camp prisoners, what does that tell the Allies about the broader scientific apparatus of the Third Reich?
It seems like it shatters the illusion that science is somehow inherently noble or separate from the politics of the state.
When you look at that timeline and those documents, it really forces you to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality about how expertise operates within totalitarian systems. The culture of science in Germany had been completely warped. Expertise, raw scientific capability, is largely amoral. It will serve whatever master controls the resources, the funding, and the laboratories.
The United States military intelligence apparatus was in that apartment in Strasbourg, getting its first real glimpse of just how advanced and how utterly amoral this scientific apparatus had become.
Precisely.
So let's look at how the American government initially reacted to this. If we move the timeline forward just a few months to the spring and summer of 1945, the war in Europe is ending. Germany is surrendering. And at this initial stage, the official American stance toward these Nazi scientists was actually very strict.
It was very much aligned with what you would expect a democracy to do.
Yeah. You have Undersecretary of War Robert Patterson explicitly stating in May 1945, these men are enemies, and it must be assumed they are capable of sabotaging our war effort.
The initial policy drafted by the State War Navy Coordinating Committee was very clear. They dictated that temporary military contracts would only be given to a highly limited number of German scientists. The explicit caveat was that these men could not be known or alleged war criminals.
So no war criminals, period.
Period. They were to be kept in strict military custody, while in the United States their knowledge would be extracted and they would be returned to Germany as soon as possible. That was the official initial design of the system.
But systems don't exist in a vacuum. They respond to their environments. And the global geopolitical environment was shifting at an unprecedented speed. We're talking about the dawn of the Cold War. The United States is suddenly looking at the Soviet Union no longer as an allied partner, but as a massive existential threat.
Right.
How did the emergence of the national security intelligence apparatus change the way the U.S. viewed these scientists?
The shift happens within the intelligence community, specifically through a group called the Joint Intelligence Committee, or the JIC. The JIC was responsible for providing overarching national security information and threat assessments for the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
And their assessments were incredibly grim.
Very. Between June and August of 1945, the JIC delivered dozens of reports that essentially mapped out the new global chessboard. They determined that the Soviet Union was ideologically hostile to the West and was actively seeking global domination.
And they made some incredibly dire predictions about when a conflict might break out, didn't they? It wasn't some vague, far-off threat.
It was an immediate, terrifying timeline. Within 1 year of the atomic bombings in Japan, the JIC warned the Pentagon that the Soviets would postpone open conflict only long enough to rebuild their own arsenal.
Wow.
Yeah, the JIC officially predicted that by 1952, the Soviet Union would be ready to engage the United States in total war. And in their assessment, total war meant the full deployment of atomic, chemical, and biological warfare.
Put yourself in the shoes of a policymaker sitting in the Pentagon in 1945. You are being handed an official intelligence estimate that says you have exactly 7 years before your nation faces apocalyptic destruction. Fear is an incredibly powerful catalyst for systemic change.
It changes everything about how you measure risk.
Exactly. But there was one specific intelligence report, JIC report 2504, that seemed to completely flip the script regarding the Nazi scientists. What did that report reveal that panicked the military so badly?
JIC Report 2504 hits the Pentagon and reveals a terrifying reality about the spoils of the German surrender. It states that 8 out of 10 of the leading German-guided missile scientists had vanished.
8 out of 10, just gone.
They had simply gone missing from the occupied zones in Germany. The military concluded that they had most likely been captured by the Soviets and were actively working inside the USSR.
And it wasn't just individuals who were missing, right? The Soviets were taking entire institutions.
The report detailed that 2 entire German physics institutes had been physically seized by the Red Army. They didn't just pack up the libraries and the beakers. They took the heavy machinery, the laboratories, the technicians, and the scientists, and reassembled the entire infrastructure deep inside the Soviet Union.
The JIC warned that these intensive Soviet scientific research programs were already underway and posed a direct existential threat to the West. This feels like the exact moment the pivot happens.
It is.
This is where the structural race for technological superiority begins to override every other consideration. You have military planners looking at this chessboard and realizing that their existing policy, worrying about whether a scientist was an ardent Nazi or an SS member or a potential war criminal, was a luxury they could no longer afford. The design incentives of the entire military system shifted overnight.
The institutional rationale becomes incredibly utilitarian. The overriding goal shifts from prosecuting enemies and ensuring justice to speed, secrecy, and technological advantage. You see this new logic perfectly articulated by Major General Hugh Nur.
Who was he?
He was the Deputy Commanding General for Administration of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe. He sent a memo to the War Department General Staff arguing that exploiting this Nazi technology was an absolute imperative for American survival.
Do we know what he actually said in that memo? How did he justify tossing the legal guidelines out the window?
You wrote it plainly. He stated, "Pride and face-saving have no place in national insurance."
Pride and face-saving. That is astonishing. He is framing the prosecution of war crimes, the adherence to democratic ideals and international law, as mere pride that needs to be discarded to buy national insurance.
Right. It reduces morality to a public relations problem.
It really makes you wonder how quickly any of our morals might shift when the intelligence system we rely on tells us that total annihilation is just 7 years away and the enemy is sweeping all the top engineering talent off the board.
That shift in incentives is what directly leads to the creation of the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or the JIOA. This was a specialized subcommittee of the JIC created with one specific, singular purpose: to recruit and hire Nazi scientists and integrate them into American weapons projects and scientific intelligence programs.
So they formed a dedicated agency just for this.
Exactly. The fact that these scientists were ardent Nazis or even war criminals became, in the eyes of this new military intelligence system, merely a troublesome bureaucratic detail. It was no longer a moral absolute. It was just an obstacle to be managed.
And managing that obstacle required overcoming a lot of bureaucratic friction because it wasn't a smooth, universally agreed upon transition. There was a massive clash within the American government, specifically between the State Department, which was responsible for legally issuing visas, and the military intelligence apparatus.
The State Department was not on board with this new logic.
Not at all. To understand this clash, we have to look at a guy from the State Department named Samuel Klaus. What was Klaus's role, and why was he such a thorn in the side of the military?
Samuel Klaus represented the old system, the one that was designed with legal and ethical guardrails. He was the State Department's representative on the JIOA board. And Klaus insisted on actually following the law. The law at the time required that for anyone to get a visa to enter the United States, the State Department had to conduct individual background investigations.
Well, I had to actually vet these people.
Right. They had to pull records from the Berlin Document Center. If a background check revealed that a German scientist was a member of the SS or the SA stormtroopers, or had won honorary awards from the Nazi Party for their service, they were legally ineligible for a visa. Klaus was essentially standing at the door, checking IDs and saying, "No, this guy is a Nazi, he cannot come in."
But the JIOA, representing the new Cold War imperative, needed these guys in America permanently. They wanted to give them visas, bring their families over, and get them comfortable so they wouldn't defect to the Soviets.
They viewed even leaving these scientists unsupervised in the ruined zones of Germany as a massive security risk. They called it a denial program, as in the primary goal was denying these rare minds to the Russians.
So if Samuel Klaus and the State Department are blocking the front door, how does the military get these scientists inside? Here's where it gets really interesting.
This is where we see the literal physical mechanics of how military intelligence bypassed the State Department's legal requirements. And it comes down to a tiny piece of office stationery.
Wait, you're telling me the military's grand, high-level espionage tactic to bypass the entire U.S. legal system was office supplies?
It literally was.
All right.
The military intelligence officers were tasked with reviewing the security dossiers of these German scientists. These dossiers were massive files compiled by OMGUS, which stands for the Office of Military Government, United States. OMGUS was the apparatus responsible for managing the American occupation zone in Germany, and they thoroughly documented the Nazi Party affiliations and potential war crimes of these individuals.
So the paper trail existed. OMGUS did their job?
They did. When the intelligence officers found an OMGUS dossier for a scientist who was highly valuable for his technical skills, but highly problematic legally, maybe he was an SS officer or involved in slave labor, the intelligence officers would discreetly attach a literal paperclip to the file.
Just a standard metal paperclip. What was that supposed to signal?
That paperclip was a silent, subversive signal within the military bureaucracy. It meant, do not send this file to the State Department through the normal administrative channels. Withhold it.
So they just hid the real files from Klaus.
Exactly. The military would then bring this individual into the United States under the guise of military custody, rather than applying for a legal civilian visa that would inevitably be scrutinized and rejected by someone like Samuel Klaus. It was a physical workaround to an ethical and legal roadblock.
That is wild. They literally clipped a piece of metal to a folder, and that was the signal to hide war criminals from their own government colleagues. And that's exactly how the program got its final name, isn't it?
Yes. Initially, the recruitment program was called Operation Overcast. But the families of the German scientists living in Germany started referring to their military housing compounds as Camp Overcast, which compromised the operational secrecy. So, referencing this discreet, subversive filing method they were using to bypass the State Department, the military officially renamed the program Operation Paperclip.
When you look at this systemically, it is profound. You are seeing an intelligence agency fundamentally redefining justice. Rather than assisting the judicial system in prosecuting these men, the intelligence agencies were actively rewriting, hiding, or withholding dossiers to protect them. The incentive structure of the Cold War completely transformed the behavior of the bureaucracy. They even managed to change the official policy language, didn't they?
They did. The initial strict mandate of no known or alleged war criminals and no ardent Nazis was quietly swept away by the bureaucracy. In March 1946, a new policy went into effect, stating that German scientists could be admitted if their entry was deemed to be in the national interest.
National interest. That is such a brilliantly vague, deeply powerful phrase. It essentially writes a blank check for the military to do whatever it deems necessary without having to justify the moral math. So what happens to Samuel Klaus? What happens to the guy waving his arms, pointing at the law, and trying to create friction?
The system simply eliminates the friction. Klaus was labeled obnoxiously difficult by the JIOA director Thomas Ford. Because Klaus refused to play ball with the new incentive structure, he was transferred out of the visa section entirely. He was stripped of any power or oversight regarding the policies of Operation Paperclip. The system protected its new imperative by removing the internal obstacle.
And with the roadblocks cleared, the program didn't just continue, it massively accelerated. When the Korean War began in 1950, that underlying fear that the communists might overrun Western Europe intensified dramatically. The military decided that simply recruiting scientists wasn't enough. They needed to buy them up wholesale.
This expansion became known as Accelerated Paperclip, or Project 63. The military determined they needed a mass procurement effort to evacuate scientific talent from Germany before they could fall into enemy hands.
How much money were they throwing at this? Because if they are bypassing the visa system, they must be incentivizing these guys heavily to leave their homes.
The Joint Chiefs of Staff approved a $1 million procurement budget for Project 63. Adjusted for inflation, that is roughly $10 million today. And this budget was specifically designated to entice what the military explicitly called especially dangerous top-level scientists to come to America.
They actually used the phrase especially dangerous.
They did. They created a master roster called the K-List, which consisted of the 150 most crucial and often most compromised individuals they wanted to evacuate from Germany.
The irony is just staggering. The American system is using millions of taxpayer dollars to actively recruit and enrich the very people it was ostensibly fighting a total war against just a few years earlier.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the new institutional logic. When technological advantage is the only metric for national survival, the past is entirely erased. And we have to look at the tangible results of this system, because the outcomes were not abstract theories. They were highly visible, globally celebrated triumphs that were deeply intertwined with incredibly dark hidden realities.
Let's talk about those outcomes, starting with the most famous ones, the rocket triumphs. When anyone talks about Operation Paperclip, they inevitably talk about Wernher von Braun and Arthur Rudolph. These men were brought to the U.S., scrubbed clean by the military PR machine, and set to work. But to understand the moral whiplash of what the system did, you have to picture the stark contrast of their careers. Where were these two men and what were they doing during the war?
During the war, Wernher von Braun and Arthur Rudolph were the key architects of the Nazi V-2 rocket program. And that program was built on the absolute worst horrors of the Holocaust. Arthur Rudolph was the operations director at the Mittelwerk underground tunnel complex in Nordhausen.
The Mittelwerk facility was infamous.
It was an absolutely brutal slave labor facility. Thousands of slave laborers, primarily drawn from the nearby Buchenwald concentration camp, lived and died in those subterranean tunnels under horrific conditions, assembling the rockets. Wernher von Braun wasn't just detached from this. He wrote memos about personally going to Buchenwald to pick out more qualified detainees to work in the tunnels.
So they weren't just scientists working in a sterile lab somewhere who happened to be German. They were fully integrated into the SS apparatus of slave labor and mass death. They knew exactly how their rockets were being built.
Exactly. But they also possessed the rarest technical knowledge on Earth regarding advanced ballistic missiles. And in the logic of the Cold War system, that knowledge outweighed their complicity in atrocities.
So what does the American system do with them? It brings them over, starts them at Fort Bliss in Texas, then moves them to the Redstone Arsenal in Alabama. And by 1960, von Braun, Rudolph, and over 100 other paperclip scientists are officially transferred to NASA. Wernher von Braun becomes the celebrated director of the Marshall Space Flight Center.
He becomes a cultural icon.
He does. He is on television. He is working with Walt Disney to produce educational films popularizing space travel. He is dubbed the father of the Saturn rocket. Arthur Rudolph becomes the project director of the Saturn V rocket program. There are highly publicized photographs of Rudolph standing proudly, holding a model of the Saturn V, the exact vehicle that eventually took humanity to the moon. They are launching rockets from White Sands, New Mexico, with a monkey named Albert strapped inside, pioneering the entire American space program.
That visual of Arthur Rudolph holding the Saturn V model is the perfect encapsulation of the visible outcome of this system. It represents a monumental triumph of human engineering. But the invisible architecture beneath that photograph, the foundation that allowed him to possess that engineering knowledge in the first place, is the middlework slave tunnel. The American system successfully amputated a scientific capability from the historical atrocity.
And rockets at least have an inspiring public face. Space exploration is something humanity can rally behind. But the systemic imperative of Operation Paperclip didn't stop at aerospace. It extended deep into the incredibly dark science of biological and chemical warfare. Can we talk about what was happening at Camp Detrick?
Camp Detrick, located in Maryland, was a top-secret U.S. military facility that was massively expanded after the war. The government poured vast congressional funding into transforming it into a state-of-the-art bioweapons research center. And it was at places like Detrick and the nearby Edgewood Arsenal that American scientists began actively collaborating with and building upon the work of their Nazi counterparts.
The details of this collaboration get incredibly dark. You have an American scientist named L. Wilson Green, who is the technical director at Edgewood. He is observing experiments involving taboon. And just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here, taboon isn't just a standard poison. It's a clear, tasteless nerve agent invented by the Nazis that causes violent convulsions, paralysis, and death within minutes.
It's horrific.
And Green is watching this taboon being tested on American soldiers inside a 9-by-9-foot tile and brick gassing chamber at Edgewood. Observing these horrific reactions, Green has a revelation. What does he propose?
Green proposes a massive pivot in chemical warfare strategy. He theorizes a new paradigm called psychochemical warfare. He realizes that killing the enemy is inefficient and creates massive logistical problems. Instead, he wants to find chemical compounds that cause mental abnormalities of military significance.
He wants to weaponize mental illness.
But essentially, yes. He wants drugs that create mass hysteria, panic, and hallucinations to incapacitate an entire enemy force without necessarily killing them. He compiles a master list of 61 materials known to cause mental disorders. This research quickly zeroes in on powerful hallucinogens, specifically looking into lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD.
And who does the American military bring into the fold to assist with building these massive, terrifying new arsenals of nerve gas and mind-altering drugs? They bring in the Nazi experts.
They hire Dr. Kurt Blum. This is the man who was Hitler's biological weapons maker. This is a man who admitted during interrogations that he had intended to test bubonic and pneumonic plague on humans at his laboratory in Posen. The United States Army hires him, and his official contract literally states he is employed in the capacity of a doctor.
It's one thing to bring these men over in secret and lock them in a lab, but the level of integration and socialization is baffling. You have Brigadier General Charles Lux stationed in Heidelberg, Germany. He is actively holding secret Saturday roundtables at his personal home. He is hosting lunches of pork chops with Nazi chemists.
Just a casual weekend barbecue.
Literally. He is breaking bread with Gerhard Schrader, the literal inventor of taboon nerve gas, and Richard Kuhn, a Nobel laureate who worked on nerve agents for the Third Reich. Lux is actually warned by the Pentagon that socializing with these men is bad form and terrible optics. How does he respond?
Lux basically writes in his diary, "I'll see them anyhow." He doesn't care about the optics because he knows the military intelligence back channels are perfectly willing to fund the exploitation of German science, regardless of how it looks. The mandate from the JIOA gave officers on the ground the implicit permission to do whatever was necessary to extract the knowledge. If we connect this to the bigger picture, what does this level of integration actually mean for the United States?
It means the result of Operation Paperclip wasn't merely a temporary boost in American technological advancement. It was the absolute structural integration of expertise that had been shaped by a totalitarian, genocidal war machine directly into the foundation of the emerging American military-industrial complex.
The knowledge of how to synthesize and weaponize nerve gas, how to effectively aerosolize bubonic plague, how to mass-produce ballistic missiles using brutal efficiency. That totalitarian expertise literally became American expertise. And because it worked, because the rockets flew, the satellites orbited, and the intelligence was successfully gathered, the Cold War logic validated the original moral compromise. In the eyes of the system, the success completely justified the methods.
But a system like this, operating in the shadows of a democracy, inevitably creates friction when the public catches wind of it. What happens when the American people, who have just sacrificed deeply, sending their sons to die on the beaches of Normandy to defeat the Nazis, find out their government is quietly hiring them? The secrecy doesn't last forever. In 1946, the New York Times breaks the story. They cite Russian sources and report that Nazi scientists are living comfortably in America under military contract. Newsweek publishes a piece revealing the actual name, Project Paperclip.
And as you would expect in a democracy, the public backlash is swift and severe.
You have major public figures speaking out. Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, the president of the American Jewish Congress, writes a scathing, highly publicized letter to the Secretary of War. He states unequivocally, as long as we reward former servants of Hitler while leaving his victims in DP camps, we cannot even pretend that we are making any real effort to achieve the aims we fought for.
It was a very clear, morally grounded argument.
Eleanor Roosevelt gets involved. She helps organize a major conference at the Waldorf Astoria in New York, with Albert Einstein as the honored guest, to actively protest the granting of visas to these Germans. You have professors at Syracuse University writing angry editorials objecting to having former Nazi Party members walking the halls of their laboratories. The public is outraged.
So the critical question for a systems analysis is, how does the bureaucracy react to this massive friction? Does the public outcry cause the military to pause? Does it initiate a moral reckoning or a congressional investigation that shuts the program down? Absolutely not. The military bureaucracy analyzes the public outrage and universally concludes that the problem isn't their policy of hiring Nazis. In their minds, the policy is sound and necessary for survival. They conclude the problem is the State Department's weak public relations. They view the Democratic pushback merely as an operational hazard, an annoyance to be managed.
So what is their solution? If you can't win the PR battle, what do you do?
You simply pull the curtain tighter. The War Department's response is to forbid the further release of information about the program entirely. They classify the movements, the names, and the backgrounds of the scientists. They shut the door on public oversight.
And this creates a dynamic that the book highlights perfectly, which we can call the secrecy impunity feedback loop.
This feedback loop is arguably the defining characteristic of the Cold War national security state. The genuine, profound fear of Soviet technological dominance is used to justify the initial need for secrecy. But once that secrecy is established, it prevents any public scrutiny, media investigation, or democratic oversight. Without oversight, the intelligence apparatus begins to operate with absolute impunity. And that impunity allows them to take even greater risks and deepen their reliance on the very specialists, the ardent Nazis, the chemical weapons experts, whose pasts would have provoked massive program-ending backlash if the public knew the truth. Secrecy breeds impunity, and impunity requires ever more secrecy to maintain itself.
But when you build a headless monster like that, a system operating with total secrecy, massive funding, and zero ethical oversight, it eventually turns on its own creators. The guardrails are gone. This brings us to the ultimate tragic offspring of this unchecked system, the story of an American scientist named Dr. Frank Olson. Who was Frank Olson, and how did he get caught in this machine?
Frank Olson was a civilian scientist. He was recruited during the war to work at Camp Detrick. By 1950, he is a senior bacteriologist working in the highly classified Special Operations Division at Detrick. His specific area of expertise was the airborne delivery of biological weapons.
Yeah.
He was tasked with figuring out how to effectively disperse lethal pathogens over wide areas, and he was out there conducting covert bioweapon spray tests alongside these paperclip scientists.
The specifics of those tests are deeply alarming because they aren't testing these dispersion methods over empty oceans. They are testing how weaponized pathogens would disperse against American citizens.
Yes. Olson and his colleague, Norman Cornoyer, traveled to Alaska and literally spray bacteria out of airplanes over the tundra to see how it travels in cold weather. Cornoyer later admitted in interviews that they used a bacterial spore very similar to anthrax. He acknowledged that what they did was not kosher because months later, monitors were picking up traces of that specific bacteria all over the United States. It had drifted massively.
And they are working hand in glove with the German experts on this. They are consulting with Dr. Harold Batchelor, an American bacteriologist who had literally sat down with the Nazi bioweapons chief Kurt Blome in Heidelberg to learn about German airborne spray techniques. They are running covert tests in the New York subway system. They are running tests inside the Pentagon itself, using harmless biological simulants to map exactly how deadly pathogens would spread through the ventilation systems.
What they are doing is violating the core tenets of the Nuremberg Code, specifically the mandate for informed consent on American soil. They are experimenting on an unknowing public. And because the secrecy impunity loop protects them, the programs only get darker and more invasive. This unchecked system at Detrick eventually birthed jointly operated, highly classified CIA and military programs with code names like Chatter, Bluebird, Artichoke, and ultimately the infamous MKUltra. These programs were heavily focused on experimenting with LSD and other psychochemicals as weapons for aggressive interrogations and mind control.
And Frank Olson, the American scientist who helped build this airborne dispersion capability, gets caught in the gears of his own machine. He becomes deeply involved in these CIA poisoning and interrogation programs. He travels to Europe, witnesses interrogations, and begins to experience a profound moral crisis. He expresses doubts to his colleagues. He wants out of the program. He is a security risk. And in November 1953, he plunges to his death from the window of the Stetler Hotel in New York City. The local police investigation, handled by Detective Ward, logs it as Case 125124. The official determination is a tragic, straightforward suicide.
It was only decades later, after congressional investigations in the 1970s, that the Olson family learned the terrifying truth. Frank Olson was unknowingly dosed with LSD by his own CIA colleagues at a retreat just days before his death. The great tragedy, as Jacobsen's book points out, is that Olson's inalienable right to be protected from harm was violated on orders from the very people and the very system to whom he had dedicated his life's work. The system had become so insulated, so convinced of its own supreme necessity, that it turned its secretive, amoral methods on its own people.
It is the ultimate cost of the secrecy impunity loop. When a system is designed to operate completely outside the bounds of morality and law for the sake of technological supremacy, no one is actually safe from it, not even its architects. So having spent the last hour mapping out this incredibly detailed, deeply disturbing history, what does this all mean? How do we look back at the 20th century knowing this? How does it change our understanding of our own history?
It creates a profound crisis in perception regarding how we understand progress. We are heavily conditioned by our education and our culture to view history, particularly technological progress, as a series of isolated, brilliant accomplishments of human innovation, driven by democratic values and national pride. When we watch the archival footage of the moon landing, we perceive it as the ultimate triumph of the free world over tyranny. But when we apply systems analysis to this history, it reveals a much deeper, entirely invisible institutional design. That monumental success was not a pure triumph of democratic ideals. It was entirely built upon vast, strategic moral compromises, meticulously hidden away inside classified bureaucracies.
The visible outcomes completely obscure the architecture that built them. When you look at the Saturn V rocket on display or the Advanced Defense Labs or our incredible aerospace capabilities, the incentive architecture that funded and protected the creators disappears. You do not see the literal paper clips attached to the OMG US dossiers. You don't see the lunch of pork chops with nerve gas inventors in Heidelberg. You don't see the institutional logic that actively decided it was acceptable, even necessary, for men who ran slave labor camps to become celebrated American scientists.
And we have to be clear about the analytical purpose of looking at this. Understanding this system doesn't magically resolve the ethical dilemma. It is very easy to say, from the safety and comfort of the present day, that the military should have just prosecuted everyone, strictly followed the law, and maintained the moral high ground. But if the United States had done that, and the Soviet Union had captured all 100% of those scientists and subsequently won the Cold War because of that technological advantage, the world would look very different and potentially much darker. The value of this analysis isn't to play armchair quarterback with history or to deliver a sermon on ethics.
Exactly. I mean, that is the core of it. The value is in recognizing the stark reality of how these institutions function under pressure. Understanding Operation Paperclip clarifies, with chilling precision, exactly how national security systems can and inevitably will completely redefine justice whenever technological advantage becomes the overriding objective for survival. It shows us that morality in geopolitics is often treated as a luxury, a pride and face-saving measure that is discarded the moment existential fear enters the equation.
But think about where this leaves us today. The Cold War that birthed Operation Paperclip may be over, but the structural race for technological superiority has never stopped. Whether we are talking about the global race to develop artificial general intelligence, the massive expansion of offensive cyber warfare capabilities, or the deployment of autonomous drone weapons, that exact same institutional logic is operating right now. We have to ask ourselves, what strategic moral compromises are currently being hidden within our classified bureaucracies today? What ethical boundaries are being quietly crossed? And who are the rare minds that our systems are protecting right now to ensure we win tomorrow's wars?
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.